boss at the BBC used to tell me, when you're not really sure what to talk about, just state the obvious. What I'm going to talk about, something is probably for you extremely obvious, but for me is an endless source of curiosity, admiration, and sometimes frustrations. So if you work in the public sector or in international development organizations, and you tend to design services for citizens, you tend to think about the average citizen. You want to try to get to everybody, and as a result, you try to hit the middle of a distribution curve. The less the money you have, the more this shrinks. And in fact, the things that are at the edges, whether it's someone with some learning difficulty, someone who has difficulty access the internet, someone with disability, these become problems at the edges and things that you need to cater for and cost extra effort. I find this view of the world really intriguing because in my experience, it is at the edges that there is an extraordinary amount of innovation, of human capital, and social capital that can be harnessed to change things. So let me give you an example. At the MIT, I study one phenomenon which is called lead user innovation. So this is, for example, patients who solve their own disease. Why do they do that? Because they have very niche diseases. Nobody is interested in investing in solving this disease because it's not profitable. They happen to have a different type of expertise which they bear to their disease to find solutions. Luis here had a very specific lung disease. He also happens to be a disc jockey in his free time. One day he goes to the opera and realizes that the vibration from the music is actually the same vibration that is being used by the hospital to treat his disease. He hacks an amplifier and creates an instrument that allows him to treat his disease at home rather than going to the hospital every day. If you go to patient innovation website, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of examples like this. Take another tragic issue, male suicides in the UK. Again, if you're a public sector, this is extremely difficult to tackle in many different ways. Mark is a barber, and one of his best friends committed suicide. Mark started investigating the issue and realized that the reason why many young men commit suicide is they don't like to go to a psychiatrist or psychologist. Mark is a barber, and what he knows from his experience is that men open up at a barber. So he creates an enterprise, he trains people. In Wyoming now it's a law that all the barbers need to be trained in detecting early signs of mental health illnesses. You probably know there is a similar, somewhat in concert, project in Zimbabwe, where again, mental health issues were a problem for the public sector. And what they actually came up with this idea of putting grandmothers on a bench. They are in the middle of a village and they listen to people. This has quite a significant impact on reducing cases of mental health. So I hope that you can see that not only at the edge there is an awful lot of innovation happening, but it also tends to explore a solution space which is not the obvious one. Because if you put a bunch of mental health specialists in a room and you say, what do we do about male suicides? Chances are they don't think about barbers. In fact, barbers for you are a problem because they are not officially certified, you cannot procure them, you don't know what to interact with them, and they often are a problem for you rather than part of a solution. Because I'm a really, really, really pesky and nerdy person, I decided to put this to an experiment. So I was working with an NGO in Indonesia, and their issue is flood. We wanted to solve the problem of floods. So basically we wanted to do a challenge. And a challenge typically would go to startups or inventors, by and large in the capital, just because of the way it works. And I said, okay, you want to do the challenge? Great. Why don't we send in parallel ethnographers to villages in the rural areas of Indonesia and figure out what kind of solutions they come up to flooding? To their credit, they went with my idea, even if I didn't like it. And what we did then is we came up with a process where the solution produced by the inventors in the capital and the solution provided by the villagers were put to a blind panel of innovation specialists. And the judges had to say which is the most effective, sustainable, and innovative. Who do you think won? The engineers in the capital or the villagers? Thank you. Doesn't take much, right? So this is Made. Made is obsessed with insects. In his village, the problem of flooding is actually that waste clogs the waterways. His bug eats the waste. He has a flourishing barter system with all the villages in the neighborhood, but he gives away his flies and he gets in return all sorts of exchange goods. All his area is flood-free. Now, with all this nice story, let me tell you, when it came actually to give an award and funding, who the NGO gave money to, the villagers or the results of their challenge? Thank you. Why? Because it's new, right? And it's much incentives on the new as opposed to what is already working and you haven't come up by yourself are often challenging to do. So we'll keep that thought for a moment. So what you can see here, I hope, is a more general phenomenon, which I'm particularly intrigued about. How many of you have heard this word, a terrible word called exaptation? Yes, thank you. So exaptation, you probably know better than I do, so correct me if I say something wrong, right? So for example, in evolution, birds evolved feathers originally to release heat. Then they had these things on their wings, and then they discovered that they can actually fly. So something that evolved for a particular purpose jumps into a different purpose. You see an awful lot of that happening at the edge. The barber that applies his expertise to suicides, the insect specialist that gets into flooding, the disc jockey that gets into curing diseases. And crises, of course, unfortunately, are an exaptation multiplier, and we've seen it under COVID, right? Scuba diving mask used for a completely different purpose. Archaeologists rediscovering ways of doing sustainable agriculture. So, I am passionate about the edges. I hope you've at least figured that out now. I think there is an enormous amount of innovation that happens there. This innovation is often non-capitalized by society. The patients that find their own disease are technically legal in most countries. Many of these solutions are actually not recognized and are not procurable, for example, by the public sector. And one of the big objections to all these things is, this is small-scale stuff. It doesn't scale. It doesn't produce system change, right? And I find this quite interesting because I actually think if you think about system change, it's much better to work with what you have rather than thinking you start from tabula rasa. And I think what Emilio just told us is a perfect example of that. So, I want to play an exercise for you, picking a system which is notoriously almost impossible to change, and very difficult one, which is the health system in most countries, right? Is it actually that by tapping into all these sources of edgy capital, human and social capital, we can actually contribute to the difficult and political topic of changing systems? So I told you that patients innovate, right? But that's illegal. In fact, those patients typically have many more hours of clinical trial tests than the actual official products in the market. Because you're a patient, you live with your disease 24 hours a day. And if you actually really care about it and studied it, there's an enormous amount of welfare that is created there by the fact that you create solutions at the edges. Nurses innovate all the time. Why? Because a standard product or the standard service that they're given doesn't really apply to all the many diseases they need to deal with. Except this is illegal. They hack all the time. So how do you flip it? You start seeing that hospitals create maker spaces inside for nurses to use and actually encourage them to hack. the official American nurse magazine, the professional nurse magazine from the 1920s to the 1940s, was called the Magazine of Experimentation. Nurses were encouraged to improvise and experiment on the things that they were provided with and share it in their professional magazine. The moment the magazine has been called the Professional Magazine of Nurses, all this experimentation has been put on the side and declared illegal. So, patients innovate, nurses innovate, doctors innovate. It's a phenomenon called off-label use. Medicines that were created for a particular purpose, you discover that they actually can be used for something completely different. It's not a very popular or interesting topic, but for example, a very common one is Botox. Botox was created for something completely different, as you know, right? These are more serious ones, but the point is, doctors have zero incentives to actually report this because it doesn't get them into journals. And so there's zero incentive for them actually to document all this innovation. And of course, social enterprises innovate all the time. This is, you probably know, ECHO is a doctor that figured out a way to deliver rural medicine in the US and then expanded into, I think it's 40 other countries around the world now. But again, what we hear from our social entrepreneurs, at the beginning you're told this is impossible, right? This is not the way these things are done. So you can see that there is a system, health, where on one hand we often complain there are no resources, there is lots of problems trying to cater for the edge of the average patient, and yet there is this enormous amount of innovation that goes untapped. Whether it's patients, whether it's nurses, whether it's doctors, whether it's social enterprises, etc. Could we actually flip a switch? Could we actually say, well, all these things that are at the edges are not recognized, are at the moment under the surface, could we actually capitalize them? And of course, in my view anyway, social enterprises have a fantastic role here, because what you find often is that innovators at the edges are not necessarily interested in starting their own enterprise, but they do share freely what they've discovered. And we have historical examples of this, of flipping the switch. Does anybody know the story of how Vietnam fought malnutrition in the 70s? Big malnutrition crisis. Two anthropologists happened to be traveling across Vietnam, and rather than asking why is there malnutrition, they say, which is the one village that doesn't have malnutrition? They discover this, the positive deviant. Turns out there's different variation of the story, but anyway, there was a different way in which mothers were feeding their kids in that particular village. Discovered it, reported this back to the government. It was such a big priority, this was turned into actual national policy, and Vietnam was actually able to get out of its malnutrition crisis. Flipping what is the edge to actually what is normal. Another example, more close to us and dramatic in many ways. So I was talking to the guys from Restart Ukraine recently, and what is happening is that in some areas of Ukraine, they have lots of influx of people from areas that are being bombed, and this is causing housing issues. And lots of interesting enterprises are starting to create co-housing solutions. Now, they told me co-housing at the moment is illegal. They are already planning to say, how do we flip a switch? How do we turn what is illegal now into actually the new way of doing housing in Ukraine once the war is over, hopefully? So, why is it so difficult, right? I told you about the example of working with an NGO that at the end actually decided to still reward the current system. And as Peter reminded us when he opened today, change is political and it really has to do with power relations. So you probably heard this sentence many times before, right? Every system is perfectly designed to deliver the results it delivers. The health system now is perfectly designed to deliver the results it delivers. And many other systems are stuck in power dynamics that keep them in the particular place. If you start looking at the edges, you start challenging these dynamics. You need to rethink very different mechanisms to do things. To give you a very practical example, For a while, at the National Innovation Foundation in India, if you were working there, you were to go to the most rural areas of India, and you were not allowed to ask people, what do you need? You had actually to document what innovations they have been doing. This is challenging very strongly way of doing things, right? You start recognizing the edge. Once you find them, you need to figure out how to actually procure them, for example, right? So you need to redesign a system that allows the commons, all this innovation that is produced and is at the edges, to be surfaced and procured. So there's a number of organizations that are designing commons to put all these things that are happening at the edge at the moment as a common good, and then to make it possible, for example, to procure people who have come up with solutions at the edges that were not possible to be procured before. You have to rethink about financing. How do you scale these things? How do you provide finance for all these sorts of experimentation that is very distributed so that it achieves systemic effects? So this is one of the things I'm personally passionate about. At the moment, I'm talking to a number of organizations that are exploring this space and say, how do we actually organize ourselves to flip a switch? If you're interested in it, I'm very happy to talk to you at the end. Thank you.